We have an outstanding panel with us today. Let me start out by introducing them. Bob Balfanz is a research professor for the Social Organization of Schools at Johns Hopkins University School of Education, where he is co-director of the Talent Development Secondary Reform Model and director of the Everyone Graduate Center. That's aspirational.
Good goal.
Good goal. He's also co-founder of Diplomas Now, which is an I-3 grant winner being implemented in 40 schools in 12 school districts. Janice Jackson.
Hi.
Janice is the Chief Education Officer of Chicago Public Schools. She began her career at CPS as a history and economics teacher at South Shore High School before successfully opening two outstanding high schools, Raby High School and Westinghouse College Prep. She was then chosen to lead Network 9, overseeing 26 schools and 14,000 students. She is a graduate of CPS and Chicago State University. She also holds a master's in leadership and administration and a doctorate of education in policy studies and urban school leadership from the University of Illinois in Chicago. Sarah Makela is the executive director of Grow Community. She has a PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago with research focused on parent involvement in education. Importantly, she has two sons in a CPS elementary school and is the immediate past president of that school's parent fundraising and volunteer organization. Sara Stoelinga is the director of the Urban Education Institute at the University of Chicago and a clinical professor on the Committee of Education. In addition to serving as a faculty member at the University of Chicago, she oversees all aspects of the Institute. Her areas of focus and expertise include school reform and history, organizational change in schools, leadership and teacher effectiveness. She is a BA and PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
So just for the benefit of our panel, so they know to whom they're speaking, how many people in the audience attended public school? Wow, that's pretty
great.
good. That is great. How many have children who have or are attending public school? Very good representation. So I will begin with a few questions, and we will provide plenty of time afterward for questions from the audience. So Bob, let's start with you.
Okay.
Emotionally, we all want to support the concept of transforming schools. But let's be practical. It's very difficult, and the success ratio is challenged, so to speak. How do you look at the transformation of schools?
Well, I would say two things. One, if you get one hit out of 3 attempts in baseball, you're in the Hall of Fame. If we say we turn around 1 out of 3 struggling schools, we say it doesn't work. So we have to recognize how difficult the work is and build our success averages against that, even recognizing that we have to get to a much higher place. We can't be satisfied with 1 out of 3, but we can't say if we're at 1 out of 3, that's a huge failure.
Although in my business, 1 out of 3, I'd be out of business. So you're saying...
But not if you're a baseball player.
Okay.
You're in the Hall of Fame, right? It's hard to hit that pitch.
Shift. Okay.
And my basic argument is that the key reason we struggle is just the big point, is that these schools are not designed for the challenge they face. These are all, the great American high schools, which drove this nation to its prosperity in the 20th century, were based on the premise that 10% of kids need extra help, 10% need acceleration, 80% you give them a good teacher, they'll come, they'll do their work, and only 30% of kids need to go to college. Now we're saying that every single kid's got to graduate and be ready for post-secondary schooling or training. And we've had the great sort in our nation in the last 40 years by income. So these schools are only intended by low-income kids. So the kids that walk in the door of these schools, 30% are over age, 30% were chronically absent in middle school, only a third are proficient, 20% are special ed, 20% are ELL. That's a huge challenge that the school's not designed for. So that's why we have low batting averages.
Janice, here's an easy one. It's fair to say that we are now in a climate in Chicago where it will be very difficult to open new schools. Transformation is then the name of the game. Some say that 20% of the charters should be closed or transformed. Let's assume that at least the same percentage of traditional schools should be dealt with in the same fashion, unless you want to provide a more accurate number. But how do you tackle such a massive challenge here in Chicago?
Yeah. Well, first, I will not quote a number around the number of schools that need to be closed. What I would prefer to do is just provide some perspective, specifically around the high schools, but I also think it's the case throughout CPS, and that's the simple fact that we have more available seats than we do have students. I think that everyone's aware that the enrollment in Chicago has declined over the past few years, and that's created some difficulties in our schools. CPS attempted to address that with the closing of 50 schools a few years ago, and anyone who's been in Chicago and followed that story knows that, there were obviously a lot of efficiencies brought about as a result of that, but the results are either mixed at best, or they haven't been captured or analyzed as deeply as they need to be. So I offer that as kind of a framing, because I think closing schools or reducing the number of options for the sake of efficiency or in an attempt to transfer schools is probably not the first step. I think the first step is getting back to the point that was just raised just around how our schools are organized. We do have to start with the fact that transforming or improving a school is a heavy feat. It's a heavy lift. And if you don't take into consideration the impact of poverty, the effects of institutional racism, and all these other factors and challenges that a lot of the students who make up majority of the students in Chicago Public School bring to the table, then we fail to address the problem in an adequate way. What I do think that, and this is the direction that CPS has been going in for the past few years, and I intend to continue to lead us in this way, is that we have to do a better job of narrowing our focus and deciding on a goal that's realistic and attainable, and in addition to using whatever theory of action we have in place to attain that goal, doing a better job explaining what we're doing and how we're transforming lives. One example would be the work that we've done around Freshmen on Track, which is probably about 8 years, maybe 10 years underway. And we have seen that a lot of energy went into that, but here we are 10 years later with a graduation rate that's almost 70%, up from 57%. There's no way to do that in 1 year. It's about slow and steady progress and really an intentional focus and picking the right lever that has implications across, a lot of different spaces. So that's the long-term plan. The short-term plan, or not so much short-term, but if we want to get a big bang for our buck, we do need more support by way of contractors who could come in and help us turn around schools. The district obviously cannot afford to do the type of transformational work that some turnaround operators can do or charter operators can do. So we do appreciate our partners who operate in that space, because they do help us with a small subset of our schools who need the type of intentional and aggressive support that the district just can't afford to do or simply doesn't have the capacity to do.
Sara, you're involved in the transformation of several schools through Grow Community. It's my understanding that you're seeking to move those schools from good to great. Tell us about that.
And thinking about kind of the challenges of this, I think the other side of it is I am coming at this thought of transformation from a place of optimism that all schools, including the two that I'm working with, but many others that maybe not doing quite as well right now, have advantages that we can leverage with support. And the work of Grow Community is doing that from a community-driven perspective, really a grassroots way of outreach on trying to play up these good things that are happening at these schools, trying to be a way to leverage the organization and the support that is circling the schools. And schools are doing that in themselves, but hopefully we can take some of that burden off of the schools because they have many jobs that they have to do. And then the other part of that is a partnership we have with UChicago Impact that the other Sarah will talk a bit about. But those are kind of the three ways that we are looking at transforming these particular schools in a particular neighborhood. And our hope is that this is something, that this model that we're working on can be something that we can look to in other neighborhoods.
But the parent involvement, the community involvement's pretty substantial.
Yeah, so Grow Community is a new organization that's coming out of an initiative that was started at the ward level. We are now spun off as an organization. I am the sole employee right now, so we are relying on the community. We're relying on a group of really committed volunteers who have tons of experience doing this kind of work at the elementary level, and we are looking to bring that to the high school level as well.
Now, Sarah, without the H, there's been a lot of work at the Institute on this issue. How do the 5 essentials fit into it?
The 5 Essentials is a really important part of the work that we're doing in the Grow community, but also in Chicago and nationally. And I think in some ways it builds on what Janice was just talking about with the Freshman on Track work. You know, I think the key to the Freshman on Track work was really this idea of putting the right data in the right hands at the right time. And if we look across the country, we see that that combination of bringing the right evidence to bear, but also training and building expertise around how to interpret data is something that moves the needle not just in Chicago, but across the country. It's something that Chicago Impact and the Urban Education Institute have been very committed to. So like Freshmen on Track, the 5 Essentials does that in the form of a school climate survey, which essentially measures the organizational health of a school and the extent to which it's organized for improvement around 5 what we call essentials, which are effective leaders and collaborative teachers, supportive environment, ambitious instruction, and involved families. The power of that survey is that it's more than just a survey, it's a diagnostic, which essentially our consortium did research that demonstrated that it's a leading indicator for school improvement on the indicators that we care about: student achievement, attendance, and disciplinary action. And that if you are high as a school on 3 out of 5 of those 5 essentials, you're 10 times more likely to improve relative to student achievement, attendance, and disciplinary action, and you're 30 times less likely to stagnate. Now, the power of that is that we saw that relationship in all kinds of schools, in schools with high-achieving kids, and our truly disadvantaged schools within the school district, and so it's a powerful indicator for organizing schools. And I think it teaches us a lesson that's really important about school reform, and that's that you can't get good outcomes for kids, no matter what outcomes you're looking for, achievement scores, or college acceptance and graduation, or improved life outcomes for young people, unless you focus on the organizational health of the school. There is no shortcut for that. And so I think that's the power of the 5 Essentials, and it hooks into this larger role that we play at the Institute of really creating indicators that matter and using those as a way to drive improvement, both here in Chicago, but also nationally, where the 5 Essentials is used statewide in Illinois, but also with millions of children and thousands of schools across the country.
Now, you operate several of your own schools. Has that
That's correct.
complemented this work in any way?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the power of the Institute's work is the fact that we have different pieces of the education field under our umbrella. So Chicago Impact really is our tools division that takes the research-based, practice-proven tools that we've developed to resolve our own problems of practice out to the field. But what that's built on top of is 3 other units that actually created these tools, not for the purpose of distribution, but for improving our own practice. So Chicago Charter is one of those units that our work, particularly around the college readiness curriculum 6 to 16 that we've developed, actually came out of the charter school. Our STEP literacy assessment came out of our charter school. You know, the 5 Essentials came out of the consortium's research. And now Impact is the engine to distribute what we've learned to help schools improve nationally. So we see these pieces of UEI, our teacher training, our research organization, and our charter school as being beneficial to the kind of learning, the practice that we've learned from and the research that we've learned from that we can then disseminate other places. So we see it all as being mutually synergistic and beneficial.
So, Bob, let's get back to baseball.
Okay.
What does it take to succeed?
Yeah, so it takes a combination, this is going to seem simple, but it's the challenge of the work, of adult capacity building, and student supports. And too often we invest in one or the other and then get disappointed by the outcome. So you get back to this picture that we have these high-need schools that only educate children in poverty, that were not designed fundamentally to have graduate every kid prepared for post-secondary. So the adults need tons of capacity building. And we are not good at investing in the capacity building of folks in education. If you look what the military does, what the medical field does, what we do in education is a joke. Just the intensity of the training, the intensity of the supports. If we give you a week in the summer, that's a big deal. The military is training all the time, and they have a whole career arc for you. And they are constantly investing in your capacity. If the challenge in hiring schools is equivalent to that, we need to do that. On the flip side, we can have the best teacher in the world and the best curriculum, and if the kids don't come, it doesn't matter. So we have very high rates of chronic absenteeism in our high poverty neighborhoods. It could be 20% in an elementary school, 25% in a middle school. It is 40%. It is 50% in some of our high schools. Can you imagine if half the kids in the school are missing a month or more of school? How does that work? To get kids to come to school, you've got to have quality relationships. You have to have the person power to form those relationships. Kids come to school for people, not for an abstract idea, especially in poverty. If we don't bring additional second shift of adults into these schools to form those relationships at the scale needed, we won't get the kids in the seats to benefit from the increased adult capacity.
The adult description, that includes principals. I mean, what sort of a role does the principal play in?
I mean, fundamental. I mean, and this is a truism. Like, a school will not succeed without a really strong leader, but a strong leader is not enough in a high needs large school. That's like we have to keep a reminder that one person alone, and that's one of the problems we made in turnaround work, is a lot of the actual early research was based in elementary schools, where there was one principal and maybe 20 adults. At that ratio, one dynamic leader, they can actually visit all classrooms. They can actually have a huge driving thing. In a high school, you may have 200 adults working for you. You may have 1,500 kids. There's no way as you as an individual can have that same impact. You have to build whole distributive leadership teams to be able to manage that scale. So again, that's one mistake we made, is we had a lot of early research in elementary schools, and then said, oh, all turnaround is the same, and not recognizing that the scale and intensity of the need, we need to change how we support principals and what we ask them to do.
Janice, as you have watched and participated in transformations of schools here in Chicago, what mistakes have been made? And what have you, going back to speaking about my own business, we learn a lot from our mistakes. It's very expensive. What would you say we've learned at CPS from our mistakes?
Not so much mistakes, but maybe opportunities for growth or to do it better. I think what we often
I'm going to use that on mine too.
Yeah.
Can you imagine telling a limited partner that was not a real loss of money?
No.
That was a really opportunity for growth.
Yeah, it's a nice frame. It softens the blow. But I think the biggest opportunity is to just not rush things. I think that, and I know that probably sounds, strange coming from, a lifelong educator, a traditional educator, because oftentimes we're forced to do things at a pace that's just not appropriate. Given the point raised about the training and just what it takes to actually launch something, test it, make sure it's tried and true, and really implement well, we just don't spend enough time in that space. The other thing, so beyond just trying to scale up too fast, I think addressing some of these issues with short-term unsustainable dollars. So, we saw the small schools movement, which I participated in, and there have been countless others that, were really good and well-intended activities, but without a sustainable model, you just see, quick results, but then 5 years later, unless it's a highly organized school around these tenets of an effective school, you just see schools kind of go back to what they were prior to either the infusion of extra dollars.
So the size wasn't the big major factor. It was these other,
Yeah, I think that's one. The other mistake I think we make is just thinking that all schools are the same. I think that there are basic tenets of an effective school that go back. We've learned a lot about what it takes to even create an effective school in high needs areas. There are a lot of examples of schools that have beat the odds, but we're unable to replicate that due to the fact that it requires not only this charismatic leader who is willing to go above and beyond, but a set of teachers who are willing to work at what are really ungodly amounts of hours and time and investment. So even when you point to schools that maybe have successfully beat the odds. When you look, deeply to see what it takes to do that, it requires a heroic effort to do it. So if we find places that work, we have to do a better job of figuring out how to scale that and replicate that in other schools. And we have to figure out models that are sustainable. What I see in a lot of charter schools, you can pick, a lot of different charter schools here in CPS. There are a lot of successful schools at the onset, but if they can't sustain or pay those teachers, you see student outcomes dwindle quickly after about 5 to 8 years. So I think we know what to do. It's sustaining it that has been an issue.
Can I add
Yeah.
to that, Paul? Because I agree wholeheartedly, Janice, with your points. And I think there's a couple of other things I would add to that. One is, and this is not just a Chicago challenge, but it's a national challenge. Yeah. I think the places that we see that are successful have a smaller number of goals with a relentless focus and evidence attached to them. Exactly. And the danger that we get into is having too many goals to try and please all the different stakeholders that are in our arenas and scattering our efforts widely and our resources widely, rather than, if you look at the places where we've seen the needle move, whether it be at the school level or the classroom level or the district level, it's we're doing these 3 things or we're doing these 5 things, and we're going to do it for 5 years, we're going to do it for 10 years, we're going to put all of our resources into that basket. And I think school districts are not good at that, and some of it's not their fault. It's superintendent turnover, it's political pressures, it's the nature of the kind of school reform engine. But I would say that's one of the challenges. I'd say the second is, and this is so basic, but sometimes we forget it, it's low expectations that are really built into everyone's assumptions, and not just those people over there and those teachers over there, but all of us. And I think one of the things that we're constantly asking ourselves at UEI and in our own school is, are our expectations high enough? And I mean really high enough for our students. And so if you get this combination of the targeted focus with the right evidence, and that's coupled with continually pushing the bar up, I think that the flip side of some of the challenges stems from low expectations, scattered focus, and then scattered energy and resources.
Now, Sara, would you say that you're a patient person? If you listened to Sir Robinson a moment ago, he said, don't rush, take your time. How much time are you willing to give your project?
I'm willing to give it as long as it takes. I mean, it's something that I've seen this community support model really kind of work in other schools, and it has not been an overnight thing. So rushing really isn't something I'm inclined to do at all. And I think what Janice is talking about for the other pressures surrounding any group, including ours, are the danger. And there's that grow community and organizations like us are working in as well. I just want to add something more, if that's okay, to what Sara was saying about the expectations, because I think because Grow Community is focused on the inside in terms of what Chicago can bring to our schools, but then on the outside, there are expectations from neighbors, from the business, from other community organizations, from elected officials around expectations in our schools. And I think, hearing that, and it's certainly important at the school level with principals, with students, with their parents, and then the ability to help the community raise their own expectations helps change the perceptions of what's happening in the schools. If we think the kids at our neighborhood school are capable of doing that work, then we think better of that neighborhood school, and we provide more support, and we send our kids to those schools. So I think it all kind of feeds on that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to just add to that. I think that one thing that actually makes us much more hopeful now to increase our batting average is that, well, as true as some of the things that the speaker said of not much change in the past 15 years, there's actually been a lot of other good change that's going to make it much more possible to do better at transforming and turning around schools. And we've heard it here, but I just want to call it out. One, so we have a much better sense of what evidence-based reforms are. The past 15 years has been a lot of work to actually do sophisticated studies, including randomized studies, to figure out what is the real evidence that works. We didn't have that 15 years ago. 15 years ago, it was a guess in the dark. Your view, my view, who has the most power wins, will do that. Now we actually have real evidence to say these things have been tested and shown to work. Two, we have a much better sense of what the indicators are. What are the on-track indicators for both kids and for schools? So we have intermediate progress points to know are we headed in the right direction, which lets us take the time we need. Because if we didn't have those intermediate progress checks, it is too much of a leap in the dark to say we're just going to wait 5 years and hope it works. But those indicators now can tell us almost on a monthly basis in some cases a weekly basis, others a year. And thirdly, we've really come to understand the power of relationships for poverty. That it's both the quality of the coursework we ask of our kids, which is the high expectations, and we can measure that much better now, but it's the quality of their relationships as well. That most kids in poverty, one of the things they have is also relationship poverty. They don't have enough caring adults of different types in their corner, because the key fact is to go from poverty to post-secondary success is the equivalent of climbing Mount Everest. And nobody climbs Everest by themselves. And that's been so you put those three things together, and it's a much more hopeful scenario for increasing our batting average.
Are you all saying in this world of transformation that we should not be satisfied or accept poor to average, that we have to say poor to great? Right. You're all in agreement on that. If you look out at this audience, there are many donors and who have been very supportive of education initiatives and improvements in this local area. But given what's going on in Chicago, you would not fault them for being somewhat disturbed and skeptical. Could you speak specifically to situations where you have seen transformation work? Just go right down the line. Maybe start, Sara. Specific evidence, just to give them some hope.
Actually, Janice, you go first.
No. I was going to. I mean, we work.
We work together.
Work together and in a very
Well, you can
collaborative
team
way.
up.
So I think that the partnership with U Chicago has helped to transform Chicago Public Schools. So anything that I will point to as evidence is the result of donors, but also our partnership with U Chicago, because the research and just data that they provide us, along with recommendations around practice, is just invaluable. So the one that I will point to again is just what we talked about earlier, in my opinion, which is just the end game. Students graduating not only from high school, but students graduating from college. Yeah. So many of you may remember about 10 years ago, or probably longer, there was a big front page article that talked about the fact that 6% of African American and Latino males and 6% of CPS students graduated, and 3% of African American and Latino males graduate from college by the age of 25. We have doubled that number we've actually raised the number for CPS students up to about 14% compared to the national average of about 18%, and for African American males and Latino males from 3% to 8%. Now, while those numbers won't get you into the Hall of Fame, when you look at those numbers, we're talking about thousands of students. So it just depends on what you consider an investment. Most educators, we look at one student beating the odds as a success. Obviously, we're expected to do more, but when you talk about an initiative that brings public and private practice together and nets thousands of students not only completing high school but going on to complete college, where you see hundreds of African American boys graduating from schools like Urban Prep and some of the other programs and partnerships that we have, I think you can make a strong case that when you focus on one thing and you bring all of the communities together, that you can really see transformation. So I think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from that level of engagement. And I've always led in a way where you focus on a few things and you do it well, and you just pick the right levers, because everything, I won't say everything else falls into place, but many things fall into place, and just try to guard against doing everything to make everybody happy. So following this person's direction just because you want to get extra dollars. I think that's a mistake that the district has made in the past. So I know that a lot of donors are skeptical, but what I hope people walk away knowing today is that the district intends to take a more focused look and focus on things that are evidence-based, so that we have greater outcomes, or more impressive outcomes.
And I would love to add on to that. We can tell the story together. Yeah. It's an honor. And I do think that the Freshman on Track story is a transformation story, and not just of one school, but at the school district level. And in some ways, that story sometimes gets lost in all the waves of budget cuts and all of the crisis that we're facing as a state. But I think it's worth celebrating that we've done this. And I just want to draw out a few reasons why I think that success story happened. One, I'll just go to evidence, straight to evidence, that this is an indicator that really is not standardized test scores. It's more nuanced than that. And I think actually putting that indicator in the right hands at the right time was the key. Yeah. So actually, the Freshman on Track indicator For years after it was discovered, the percentage of freshmen on track stayed flat in Chicago public schools for 5 or 6 years after the consortium first came out with that indicator. It wasn't until the school district put in an every 6-week reporting cycle with high schools saying, this is the list of your students that are off track. These are the kids that are at risk of being off track. Intervene with them, that the line actually started to go up. And it became this grassroots movement where their nonprofit organizations started to use Freshmen on Track as their way, like City Year adopted Freshmen on Track as one of their indicators to pay attention to. They focused their efforts in Chicago on the freshman year, for instance. And so when you build this grassroots, bottom-up and top-down effort around powerful data, this is what happens. And I just want to add one more thing that I think gets lost on this. Honestly, I think this is about expectations as well. Because these lists of students, these are students that high schools might have said, I don't know if we can do anything with these kids in the past. But, it's just attendance and grades. We just need to focus on that. We can do that. We can intervene and try to get kids to school. We can think about them helping to pass these core courses. So it made a more simple construction out of a problem that was very complicated, and I think it changed mindsets at the school level about what was possible for these students. I think that's part of the miracle, is simply that.
Sarah, with the H, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Grow Community is a new organization, so I wish I had a 5-year perspective on this question. I don't. So I'm going to shamelessly actually steal an example that I've heard the principal at one of the schools I'm working with give many times, that to her is indicative of transformations that are happening at her school that I'm not taking credit for, but I think they're examples. And it speaks again to this community, what I was talking about in terms of community expectations. She gives an example that in her tenure, she's heard anecdotally from students that they had a sense of shame in attending the school. Shame may be a bit strong, but they were embarrassed that this was the school they were at, and they don't feel that way anymore. And part of it is because they're having interactions with the community that are saying, hey, I hear this is a great school. I hear good things are happening there, and that is influencing the climate at that school. And that's a really small example, but the ability to multiply those things, and again, it's a reinforcing thing. We work at the transformation through Freshmen on Track analysis. Those interactions with the community are going to increase, et cetera, with other schools.
Every element help. You're in 40 schools. There's got to be one that's really a standout.
We have a program called Diplomas Now, which combines whole school improvement with enhanced student support. It's guided by early warning systems, to way to say on track. And we're actually doing a large randomized study across the nation. 40 schools, 60,000 students. And some of our schools now in their 4th and 5th and 6th years, and any number of them are starting to pop now. We've had schools where their grad rates have gone from the 60s to the low 80s. We've had multiple schools come off state lists as being low performers to being high performers. We had one school in San Antonio that now has gotten 5 or 6 levels of distinction from the state, including college and career readiness, which never happened before for a neighborhood high school in San Antonio. So once you put all these pieces together and stay with them for these 4 or 5 years, it's really in that 4th and 5th year that you start to see big pops. You really start to see these leaps forward. And the other thing I just want to point out is we also look at this nationally, and there's actually been some real progress. In early 2000s, the nation's graduation rate was 71%. It had been that way for 30 years. It's now 82%. It's increased 10 points in over a decade. And a large part of that came because in 2000, there were 2,000 high schools with graduation rates below 60%, which were producing half the nation's dropouts. That number's been cut to 1,000 now. Some of those were closed, some of those were replaced, but the largest percent of them got better. Some just got a little bit better, granted, but some got a lot better. And that national graduation rate has been driven by improvements among low-income and minority students. They've been the drivers of that. So sometimes locally it's hard to see this because like 1 or 2 schools have gotten better, and we all see the one school that hasn't. And we all just put our mind on that one school has never gotten better. We've tried 10 things. We don't quite see the one over here that's done a lot better. But if we aggregate across those across the nation, there's been quite a bit of progress.
Janice, did you want to?
No, I just wanted to just highlight the importance of partnerships like the rural community and piggyback on something that Sara said. When we look at, and there are a lot of different organizations who are attempting to do something similar, work with a small group of schools, get the community more engaged. I can't highlight enough how important that is. I remember as the network chief in Network 9, we were working in particular in Hyde Park, and we were talking about how do we get residents to reinvest in the schools. There are a lot of people with young children who live in the community but don't yet feel comfortable sending their students to the CPS schools that are available to them. So I think that when communities come together, not only does it build efficacy amongst the students who currently attend the schools, but it builds confidence amongst the residents to actually send their kids and reinvest. I mean, just as, and this is a choice thing, I believe people have a right to send their children to whatever school they see fit, but I think that when we talk about transforming schools, in addition to resources and other supports, the biggest contribution is sending your own children to those schools, because if we have educated people, people with resources, more importantly, people with power whose children actually attend the schools that we're trying to support and develop or participate in the school system, maybe not the exact schools, I think that you'll see greater change. I think it's easier if it's something that you're allowed to be in and out of. And I think that in Chicago, we still have a ways to go with that. It's a place where you can invest, but you can easily move in and out. I'd like to see more of a community focus where people are not only invested with their dollars, but invested with their most important resource, which is their child. And for me, that's why it's important that my child attend a Chicago public school. Chicago public schools did well by me. I think they're going to do well by my children, and I just think that as a leader in the district, that's one of the things that I hope to do. I measure our success by seeing more people come to Chicago public schools as an option. I think that kind of commitment is what it's going to take to see some full-scale change. So I appreciate, partnerships like what you're doing with schools. I know the schools you're working with.
That's a great transition to the audience. Are there questions, particularly from the skeptics? Yes.
I'm just curious in terms of the relationships that are happening in the classrooms, particularly with the impoverished kids, because that's the relationship that's going to be encouraging them if they don't have it at home. And I'm just curious where some of the tenured teacher issues that have come up, and some of the quality of the educators, and how where is there transformation that's happening within CPS to bring up the quality and transform some of the educators as well?
I think CPS has some of the best teachers, honestly. I think if you look not nationally, if you look at the state, we train all the teachers. So when you go to the suburbs and if you poll them, many of them started in CPS. So I think there's an underlying assumption that the teacher quality is poor, and I just think that's downright wrong. I think the conditions for teachers is very poor, and I think that contributes to a lot of the things that you see. So I think that whether it's a veteran teacher or a new teacher who doesn't have the resources, we could do a better job to make that transition more seamless. I think that class size is an issue. Some of the behavior issues or lack of preparation as teachers have to deal with. I don't know. I think it'd be difficult for anybody to teach under those circumstances while being villainized publicly because they want to be paid a living wage. So I think for teachers, I'm a big proponent of teachers, if you can't tell already, but I think that you raised an important point earlier, which was around developing capacity. If we really believe, which all of us, that have children, we drop our children off every day to teachers, and you believe in them. And I think that if we believe and invest in our teachers the way that we expect the teachers who we trust our children with, we see better outcomes in our district. So teachers deserve to be paid, but they, more importantly, and I don't think they argue as much about pay as they do around professional conditions. And I don't think we do a good job training and developing our teachers once we hire them.
So can I add?
Yeah.
Can I add on to that too? Because I have the good fortune of working at an organization that has both a school, which employs teachers, but we also prepare teachers. We have a teacher preparation program. And it becomes really clear to me in operating in both of those realms that part of the problem is the distance between K-12 and higher ed on this issue. that these are almost like two different spheres, and we need to have better conversations about preparation. K-12 needs to be informing higher ed about what they need in the classroom, and there needs to be a closer relationship between those two spheres. Now, one thing I will give the state of Illinois a lot of credit for is that they, like other states across the country, are really pushing for more collaborative relationships in preparing teachers better. But I honestly think as a field, we generally do a very poor job of preparing our teachers to work in the kinds of neighborhoods and classrooms that they're going to face in a school system like Chicago Public Schools. And that's not intentional. Yeah. It's just because there's something very context-specific about working in urban classrooms. And I don't know that we've gotten the formula just right on the higher ed side, and I don't know that the communication flow between K-12 and higher ed is exactly right. So I think we have a long way to go relative to resolving those issues, to stop pointing the finger across those lines. I mean, I'm one of the rare people that sits on both sides to get better teachers prepared, get them better prepared for the context they're going to face.
Yeah. The system needs help building the case that we have got to align resources to the degree of difficulty at the school level and recognize that it's not the same. Just because you're a CPS elementary school, it's not the same school to school. There's a subset of our kids that essentially in their elementary catchment area, they are exposed on a daily basis to acts of violence. It means over an 8-year thing, they could experience 4,000 acts of violence in their neighborhood. Think about that if you're K-8. There are other neighborhoods where it's on the order of 40 in that same time period. Those schools don't need the same resources in terms of things like trauma nurses and pediatric psychiatrists. And it's really hard for systems to say we're going to give a lot here and not here without a lot of cover and a lot of support and a lot of outside analytics saying we have got to align our resources to the degree of difficulty, and degree of difficulty is highly varied even within a city. And I think that's just a key thing of playing that sabermatics to say, for those teachers not to be overwhelmed, if you have 100 chronically absent kids, you as a teacher can't call 100 kids every day. You've got to have community-based partners that increase your capacity so all those kids get outreach, and it's not just on you. Again, not every school is going to need that same ratio, so we have to figure out how can we change the ratios based on the actual need.
On Sir Ken Robinson's comments earlier about creativity in the schools and whether there's any transformation of the actual curriculum that's required, and additionally on his thoughts on kind of the testing that's required. That's stuff that having a mother-in-law who's a teacher and hearing her feeling like she's always testing her students, whether there are any thoughts on changing either of those.
Well, I just think on the testing side, there's no question that there's a big pendulum swing happening nationally on the testing scene, and this occurred because if you look way back in our history, we really had no accountability measures for schools whatsoever. We didn't actually have a way to capture school quality at all. And then when you fast forward into the 1990s, at 1995 really to present across the country, you see this heavy reliance on standardized tests in particular, which with the dawning of the Common Core movement has reached an all-time high. And so you have these overlapping, everybody understands standardized tests don't measure everything, so then we bring in formative assessments and we layer those on top, and then we're piloting the Common Core assessments on top of that. And we've reached a breaking point relative to what students and families will tolerate relative to this testing culture. And you see that there was pushes for opt-out and those kinds of approaches, and I understand that because I think parents and communities are frustrated. So the question for me is, how do we hold on to what we've learned about how to effectively measure school quality, which you need some of these assessments to capture, and not go back to the bad old days of actually not measuring at all what's happening in schools. Yeah. Sometimes education reform field is a big pendulum swing field. And my big fear is that we'll throw the baby out with the bathwater and we'll forget that before we started using standardized tests at all, there were a lot of places that didn't pay attention to whole subgroups of kids, didn't actually show that the achievement gap existed. That was kind of hidden in aggregates and averages. Yeah. And so I think our big challenge as a nation now is to find the balanced middle ground, which I actually think in education, the middle ground is a radical idea. We usually are the pendulum swing field. Yeah. So That's my take on it. I don't know if you would agree with that,
I
Janice.
agree completely. And I didn't hear the earlier presentation, but my own educational philosophy is around just that level of creativity and what I just term a love for learning. And I think it's unfortunate. I don't think teachers feel that they have the latitude to do that because of the pressures of testing. But I agree with Sara that if we go too far back, then I'm afraid of what the outcomes might be. So somewhere in the middle where teachers feel like they have the space to be creative while also, ensuring that high quality instruction is happening in the classroom. And I've always been of the philosophy that if the curriculum is strong and that if you challenge students and provide supports, you can't just have high expectations without the scaffolding and support, that students are going to do well no matter what assessment you put in front of them. And that's what we see happening in schools that, have been organized a certain way for a long time around success. So hopefully we do a better job. CPS is committed to reducing the amount of testing. It's a big challenge, but that's actually one of my number one priorities. So,
Did you?
I mean, all I would say, and I think the power of the creativity gets at is that what kids need to succeed is that really strong instruction, and then beyond that, hope and purpose. And it's often in those creative activities that you find hope and purpose. And it is that blend of that strong instruction. We can't take our eyes off that. I mean, it's the quality of the coursework kids do is what drives their cognitive growth. And without strong cognitive growth, you are not going to be able to be creative. So we have to, but on the flip side, if you don't have hope and purpose, you often don't have the fortitude to stick with that cognitive growth because you don't see the point.
Well, I'd like to
That's a great
thank each of you for what you're doing and for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.